Good morning, West Portal. It's a privilege and a pleasure to gather together. Before we kind of jump into our text this morning, just a bit of a family update. Some of you may remember Marie Friesen. Marie Friesen is a long-standing West Portal member. In fact, I don't quote me on this, but she may have been the longest living member of our church, as I believe her time goes all the way back to the late 50s when West Portal was founded as a mission chapel on 20th Street. Marie is I would call her feisty from my time with her. Wonderful, smiley, warm-hearted, and passionately outspoken person. You never had to guess what she was thinking. And she hasn't been able to gather with us, of course, for years. She's been part of a care facility, but she passed away. This last Tuesday, her family called just to let us know. So as you think of Marie and of her family, feel free to keep them in your thoughts and your prayers as well. There's no service per se. The family is choosing to just do some kind of close-knit things together. And so just a little bit of kind of a family update as we say goodbye to somebody who's had a long-standing history with us as a church family. As I suspect you are aware of, we have been walking through the book of Exodus this fall as a church, the story of the forming of a community where God will reign as king, the forming of a people group. Of course, before the Israelites can ultimately commit kind of, if you will, to serving God in this kind of a fashion, they first need to be rescued from or freed from the obligation that they have to serve a different king, and a tyrant in this case, Pharaoh. And this kind of cosmic conflict between Pharaoh, who's this anti-God figure, and Yahweh, the creator, whose people are these, is really front and center in the conversation that we were having last Sunday when we came to kind of what we would call the signs and wonders, right? Or what we sometimes refer to as the plagues. There's this cosmic battle happening for the stakes of these people. Now, before we get into our story today, I just need to acknowledge we come to a hard passage today. And it doesn't matter who you are, or really where you've grown up, or how long you've been a Christian, or whether you're not a Jesus follower. This is a story that is tough for us to wrap our head around. It's tough for us to wrap our heart around, and it's uncomfortable. And I think there's something, I want to just say, as hard as this is, and I don't want to apologize for the story we find ourselves facing this morning. I don't want to make excuses for God. I just want to say I think sometimes it's healthy for us to have to sit down with aspects of God that don't fit into the neat and tidy box that kind of most of us have and expect God to conform to. There's times where he just refuses to do that, and we have to be okay in those moments to wrestle with who our God is and his character, or the character that we find. Now, before we get into the story, what I want to do is I'll call this table setting again, but there are 4 things I just want to kind of make you aware of that I think offer some perspective. I have this science fiction kind of a sound going on here. We'll just work with it. There are 4 things that I think will help offer some perspective on this story. These will not make it easier, but these are aspects that that the heart pushes back against. And if we table these at the outset, at the very least, I think this helps us process the story. Disclaimer, each of these that I'll offer just a few sentences about is worthy of a very full-formed and robust conversation on its own. All right? But the first is this. On the subject of judgment, which is a word that our North American Western culture in particular is just naturally very averse to. And this is just almost comical to me, but COVID has created this strange environment where, I'll be offensive not just with what I say, but how I say it this morning. That'll be fun. COVID has created this strange environment whereby we are very sensitive to anyone that wants to express a different opinion, different perspective, or, heaven forbid, imply that they think we should make a different life choice than we are making. And COVID's a small taste of this, but we have this kind of throughout our culture. It's part of just kind of how we're wired. And we have this wonderful expression that shuts down conversation on this front. We just say, "Don't judge me." And it's the proverbial mic drop, because it's very difficult to re-engage conversation once somebody's kind of put their finger out and accused you of that. There's something in our human heart that says, if anybody is going to tell me how to live my life, it won't come from somebody who I perceive as an equal. And so we have kind of a secondary expression that goes with this. We go, don't judge me. Who do you think you are? God. Right? If anybody's going to tell you how to live your life, it needs to be somebody we see as not our equal. Now, what's interesting to me is I feel like when we open our Bibles and we come to a hard story like we do today in Exodus, we have a tendency to read it through the same lens. We go, who do you think you are? God? We go, oh. Now, it won't make it easy, but it's part of that sense of judgment that confronts us. Now, here's what I want to say. On the subject of judgment, make no mistake about it, friends, you and I want to judge. As uncomfortable as we are with this subject, we actually want a judge. And I'll put it to you this way. Nobody wants to live in a judge-less or judge-free country. Think of all the tax dollars we could save if we just said, I don't think we should need a police force. Think of all the wasted money in our court system. Think of what we could reallocate to healthcare and to transportation and to our education system. We'll just be a judge-free zone, and it'll be wonderful. You can guess where that would go. Nobody wants to live in a judge-free country. I want to suggest to you, we also don't really want to find ourselves in a judge-free universe. Nobody wants to be judged personally. That is always going to be a deeply uncomfortable conversation for us. But we want our lives and the choices to matter. As much as you and I don't want to be judged personally, we can think of a few people that should be judged. We want the consequences of people's action. We want people to be held to account to this. And there's something in the human heart that would be really disappointed if somehow in the scope of eternity, lives like Mother Teresa's and Adolf Hitler's were just kind of judged the same, with the same kind of indifference. It was life. It's something that doesn't sit right. So at the outset, as uncomfortable as any subject is about God as judge, I just want to say we actually want this, as uncomfortable as the subject is. Now, secondly, judgment should disturb us. Why? Because judgment disturbs God. Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet, I want to say it's in chapter 28, refers to God's judgment as his strange or his alien work. There's this wonderful poetic expression that implies this is not God's preferred way of interacting with his good creation. It's something that's actually kind of been forced on God because of humanity's sin and selfishness. I'll suggest to you, if Adam and Eve had not messed things up in the garden, we would maybe never know God as judge. It's a response to something that's become necessary. Good parents, by their very nature, will discipline their children from time to time, not because they've been just waiting for a chance to finally punish them, but because they care enough about the character of their child, about the trajectory of their child's life, about the impact their child's actions are having on those around them, that they won't turn a blind eye to that forever. Occasionally, they will step in and address that. And biblically speaking, this is the language of our Creator as well. Not God's preferred way for interacting with his creation, but he cares too much to turn a blind eye indefinitely. There are times he will intervene and act. And I'll maybe just add on that thought as well. Any act of judgment that God chooses to do or engage with within time and space is at best always going to be partial. It is not ultimate justice. It's not final justice. There will be a final balancing of the scales when we kind of stand before that. I think we sometimes refer to it as the judgment seat. Then there will only be the individual and perfect justice. But within the fabric of the world as we know it, justice will, even God's interaction with it, will be partial and not finished. Thirdly, friends, as awkward as Old Testament stories of God's judgment are for us to grapple with, and we have to stare into them. We say God is unchanging, so that we cannot be dismissive of this. We're going to have to hold it up and wrestle with it. But we need to remember the Old Testament is only part of that story. It is only part of God's story, which has an arc to it. that culminates in Jesus. I want to say it's in John's Gospel, chapter 1, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but he says in essence, nobody has ever seen God, but Jesus has made the invisible God visible to us. If Jesus is who he says and claims to be, God wrapped in human form, there's something we instinctively understand, and that is if we want the most complete, full understanding that we can possibly have of who our God is, of how his heart beats, and what his character desires to look like, lived out in interaction with his creation, relationally, Jesus is the lens that we need to look at for this. We need to look at the hard story of Exodus, but we also need to look at it from the vantage point of the full story and through the lens of Jesus. At the very least, that will not make it easy, but we're going to hold those together and in tension. Last point, and we do not like to acknowledge this, but our sinful and selfish choices have always and continue to have often negative impact for those around us. And what I might say is, this is the nature of sin, is that it's relational and it impacts, it like waves, it ripples out from us and it touches lives around us that we wish it shouldn't. So, and I'll just ask this in two questions. I won't even bother answering them because I think the answer is implicit, and I won't even use the word sinful choices, but do the choices of parents today still have the potential to do tremendous negative damage to the lives of their innocent children? Do the choices of parents still have the potential to do tremendous damage to the lives of their innocent children? Absolutely. And I don't need to cite examples of this. You know this. That it's not that it's the kid's fault. This is the nature of sin in a relational world. It impacts those around us. This is also a front-loaded question. Do the choices of government leaders continue to impact the general population for better and or for worse, regardless of whether you agree with the decision and regardless of whether you voted for the party? Yes, they do. We sometimes call this like a corporate solidarity. There's a sense that we are on the hook together as a community, as families, for the choices of others. And this is as awkward and as hard-hitting as the Exodus passages that we come to today. This is not a stunningly new development. This is something that has always been part of the nature of sin in the world, and it's part of what continues to be the nature of sin in this world, is that it does and can do tremendous damage, life-altering damage, life-taking damage to innocent people around us. And these are all things that we at least need to kind of keep in mind as we come to this kind of a story. I think with that said, let's get into our text today. Exodus 11, 12, and 13 is where we are. I'm once again going to be encouraging you, and hopefully you've been reading ahead and reading along with us. I'm not going to read these kind of 3 chapters in their entirety. We'll just pick and choose a few spots. But let's jump in at the beginning of 11, and I'll read the bulk of that very short chapter because it sets up the 10th plague itself. Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. So Moses said, quick intersection here. Last week at the end of the 9th plague, we said Pharaoh kind of ends this conversation with Moses, says, if I ever see you again, you're a dead man. It's kind of implied that as Moses turns to leave, this is what he says. He hasn't already left. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the slave girl who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any man or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will leave.' And then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh." Even Moses is frustrated that it's had to finally kind of come to this point. The 10th plague, it's helpful to view the 10th plague in conjunction with the 9th. And I'll piggyback a little bit to some stuff that I didn't have time to talk about, if memory serves, last week. So the 9th plague is 3 days of darkness, if you recall. Ra is the Egyptian sun god and would have been considered one of the most powerful, kind of within their, I was going to say pyramid of gods. That, even I'm proud of that. But for the Creator to have his way with this powerful and Egyptian deity is going to send an unmistakable message. It should also send an even more powerful message right to the heart of Pharaoh, because Egyptian kings were, figuratively speaking, understood to be the son of Ra. So there's a son's theme, right? Pharaoh is the son of Ra and therefore represents a godlike figure. His son will be considered. And so there's already this kind of ripple effect. The 9th plague is kind of the equivalent of Moses turning to Pharaoh and saying, "My dad is stronger than your dad." I don't know. That was a thing when I was growing up in elementary school. Is that still a thing nowadays? That occasionally when the debate between kids got hot, one kid would turn to the other and say, "But my dad can beat your dad up." Somehow that ended the argument. I've always felt sorry for my children on that front. They just have to hang their heads and go, "We know." Our dad can use bigger words than yours. I don't know, whatever kind of nerdy response they have to find. But so here's the deal. Why is life demanded at this point? Handful of things. And I'll just say, friends, there really appears to be a logical progression here. We were saying this last week. The whole point of the signs and wonders story is that people would know and respond to the true God. Opportunity after opportunity after opportunity is given for people to know. And what we said is, as the signs increase, as they become increasingly more spectacular, so too, guess what, do the consequences of not responding. And the consequences start out with inconveniences. Well, we have to dig some new wells for drinking water. Carcasses of frogs really smell. There's no bug repellent anywhere to be found in Egypt. But we move from inconveniences to the land starts to be damaged, crops are lost, animal life is lost, and from there it moves to kind of human suffering starts to become involved. Painful boils and sores break out. You can see the escalation that's happening, and at some point, it's not a surprise. If the signs and wonders are going to continue to increase along with the consequences, at some point, life is going to be on the table. Now, probably the hardest question for us to wrestle with is, why firstborn sons? And again, I don't have an answer that will make you feel better, but let me suggest to you, this needs to be understood against the backdrop of Exodus chapter 4. Good, we have that up there. When we walked through Exodus 4, it didn't make sense to park here. So this is where I want to come back to this. Exodus 4. God has kind of just recently recruited Moses out of the Midianite wilderness. "I want you to go back and rescue my people." Moses, we've had this argument back and forth about Moses' reasons for why he shouldn't do this. And we come to this portion where God basically says, when you get back to Egypt, I want you to grab some of the Israelite elders, go to Pharaoh, and here in part is what I want you to say to him. Now look at this. "Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go so that he can serve and worship me. If you don't do this," and here's where we have a number of kind of cultural expressions. We would say, you're about to get a taste of your own medicine. You are about to be fed your just desserts. Or we might say, the sandal is on the other foot, something like that. I just want to say the stakes, the son stakes, the wager has been on the table from the outset. God has said, you remember those babies that were being thrown into the Nile River? My children. You see the oppression that's happening, the suffering that you're inflicting, that's on my son. if you continue to insist or persist in this, at some point the consequences are going to be what we might say are reciprocal. You can expect at some point it to be meted out to the degree that you have been meting it out. And here once again is where it's important for us to remember God doesn't just show up with the 10th plague. There have been 9 previous significant opportunities to not have this come to this point. Pharaoh's magicians have turned to him and said, "This is the finger of God." Pharaoh's advisors have turned to him and said, "For the love of yourself and your country and your people, just let these Israelites go." This, in part, is why it's come to this point. Why cattle? You can picture animal rights activists everywhere going, "No!" God is making a statement. We were saying this again last week. Part of what's happening here is that Egyptians, that Israelites, that the entire world will somehow point back to this event and know unmistakably who the true God is. And so as part of that story, Yahweh is making sure that he is unmasking and defeating all rival gods, that there will be no other way that you can tell this story than to say this is the one God. The short answer is the Egyptians worship their animals too. And it's possible that had the animals been left completely alone, that the events could be interpreted as, well, some of our animal-shaped gods really were unhappy with us, and they did this to us. So every last possible god that could be, this action could be attributed to, is being addressed and dealt with in some point. And that brings us to the point in the story where we're told a loud wail or a loud cry is what's going to announce this particular plague. By the way, it's the same word that's used earlier to describe the cry of the Israelites as they're being oppressed. And so there's this unique kind of bracketing in our story that says the cry of the oppressed is about to become the cry of their oppressors, which is kind of a really beautiful kind of a picture. Sad and tragic, but if you were on the oppressed side, that would be different. Let's just pick up a little into chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month," oh, I won't keep going. Let's stop there. Back to the 9th plague. I was just referencing this before. And again, we didn't have time for this last Sunday. The 9th plague is 3 days of darkness. Darkness is a creation language word. We've been saying throughout this series that Exodus story is told with creation language, kind of through the lens of the creation story. And in the ancient Near East, creation story was generally told as a creator who brings order to the chaos in different ways. And Genesis kind of chooses to work with this kind of a theme and idea as well, right? Water would be chaotic without boundaries, so we divide the land from the water, etc. Here's my question for you. What is the very first chaotic element that the creator God in Genesis is said to overcome? Darkness. There's you can't see, you can't do anything. And the very first element of creation that needs order brought to it is darkness. And so the whole plague narrative is this reversal of God's good creation that, at least figuratively and kind of with imagery, brings us all the way back to a pre-creation state. We're back at the beginning. But it anticipates on behalf of the audience what new creation is God about to bring forth out of this. What new beginning, new creation, new people for God's purposes in the world is about to kind of burst onto the scene. And this is the imagery and the picture that we're given for this kind of a story. And an event of this kind of significance and scope needs to be tangibly remembered. It needs to be marked somehow indelibly onto the calendar. And so this becomes the new first month for the nation of Israel. Their annual calendar will forever tell the story of how they were formed and shaped to become God's people. And we'll maybe come back to that a little bit later. At this point, our text moves into kind of a bunch of detail about two different a meal, the Passover meal, and a festival, the festival of Unleavened Bread. And these are things we just want to talk a little bit about. I'm not going to read all the details for you. You are, of course, welcome to do that. Short form, the Passover meal, and there's a lot of details about how you pick the animal and how you cook it and what kind of spices, and there's interesting things we could talk about there. For our purposes, let's simplify this. It was essentially a family meal. Depending on the size, you maybe would bring additional people into your home for this. A 1-year-old lamb or a kid goat, the word is flexible, was chosen here without defect, we're told, and this becomes kind of the main course of the meal. What's particularly unique about the Passover is that it's the blood of this animal that is supposed to be painted on the door frames and on the right of the home. And in this way, maybe I'll say it this way. When you and I, we live in such a virtual world. We have memberships that we sign up for all the time, purchases we make online, whatever. And when we do this, there is often this opt-in or opt-out clause that comes along with this. You make a purchase on Amazon and they'll say, would you like to be a part of Amazon Prime for the next month for free? And you can opt in or you can opt out. And you'll buy something from the source and be like, oh, would you like to receive a monthly newsletter with all of our, new stuff and sales that you might be interested, etc., right? You can opt in, you can opt out. The 10th plague comes with an opt-in, opt-out clause. This makes it unique. Up until this point, the plagues have either hit Israel and Egypt together, or they have hit Egypt and not hit the Israelites entirely at God's discretion. God says this is what's going to happen, and people have to deal with it. But the 10th plague is different. It said, something is going to happen to all people here, Egyptians and Israelites. Life is going to be asked. But there's going to be an opt-in or an opt-out clause that you can engage with. One of the things we've been saying throughout is that the whole purpose of these is that people would know and respond to God. I think I mentioned this last Sunday, but one of the things that I find fascinating is asking the question, how much do the Israelites actually know of their God at this point? Their history has been spotty, and it's really tied to really just a couple of kind of patriarchal figures, but there's not a lot of events that they can mark in their calendar in a way that is definitive. Oh no, our God did this. This becomes one of those tangible moments where God says, if you really believe who I am and that I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do, here's a way that you can express a faith-based response to this. Eat this meal, paint the blood on your doorframe. And what we discover, of course, this is the symbolism or the meaning of this. I'm just skipping ahead to verse 12 of chapter 12. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. The temptation would be for us to read this and think of blood as just some kind of cultic marker, that it's the blood that wards off, destruction in this case. That would be to miss the point. The point here is that life is going to be asked for equally of Egyptians and Israelites, but a substitute can be offered in lieu of that life. And the life of the lamb becomes accepted in lieu of the life that would otherwise be demanded from that house. Everyone who paints this blood on their doorframe has the option to kind of opt in, if you will, to kind of the people of God, or to opt out of the 10th plague, depending kind of how you want to word and work with that. So there's some rich symbolism that's going on in the midst of this. We're told this is to be a lasting ordinance for them. The Israelites are to remember this night, to impress it on their collective consciences, to pass it on to their children. I just want to suggest, you and I think of the word remember in a strictly, I need to mentally recall something that happened in the past. This meal is an active remembering, a way of tangibly entering into the story so that people who will eat of this later on, in a strange way, participate, if you will, in the Exodus story and continue to be shaped and formed as the people of God that this story kind of introduces and inaugurates. And in that way, I was going to say, does this remind you of any meal that you and I occasionally have the opportunity to participate in? Kind of a symbolic meal that has a lot to do with being formed and shaped as the people of God. And I hope the answer is yes. If it's not, this is the Lord's Supper for us, where Jesus takes the Exodus Passover and he infuses it with new meaning. And we're actually going to participate in that together next Sunday when we have a little bit more time. I think that'll be appropriate for us. Yeah, we have a little bit of time left. Feast of Unleavened Bread. I would not normally talk about this, but because we never talk about this, it becomes kind of a great spot for us to just say a few words. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, if you're to read some of the details that will follow here in chapter 12, it's a 7-day festival. Obviously, that's not what the Israelites are going to hit the pause button to do here in Egypt. They have to leave quickly. So that's not what's going to happen. They actually won't do this for years. Not until they're settled in the Promised Land, I believe, is when they'll first start to practice this particular feast. So, why unleavened bread? Well, on a surface or a pragmatic level, it's a form of reenacting the story of the Exodus. The Israelites are going to have to depart quickly. There is no time for bread to rise. Hence, it's going to be made without yeast. Eating this for 7 days becomes a way that future generations kind of identify with their ancestors and kind of enter into this aspect of the story. But I think it gets interesting beyond that. So let me just pick up a little bit here at verse 17 of this chapter. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month, you are to eat bread made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your houses. I love that. That's an odd command, isn't it? Like, honestly. No yeast found in our houses? So I was doing a bit of reading on this past week. It might interest you to know that devout Jewish families to this day have a ritual practice that they go through the night before Passover to purge their house of any leaven, yeast, or anything that has kind of those fermenting agents in it. Now, what's fascinating is, don't you clean your house normally? Like, how hard would you have to look to find like some, leftover breadcrumbs on the floor? The house, of course, has usually been cleaned beforehand already. So what they'll actually do is they'll make this into a full-blown ritual. And they may distribute upwards of 10 strategically placed breadcrumbs or Cheerios or something like that. And it becomes a family excursion. There's a lot of symbolism that goes into this. They'll do it by candlelight and whatever else. So I just, in my head, I keep thinking of this as kind of a less exciting version of the Easter egg hunt. Because when you get to the end of it, it's like, don't put that in your mouth. Oh, right. We just need to get rid of this. But it becomes, you can think of it this way, but it becomes this powerful family storytelling of what it means to purify your house as you prepare to eat the Passover meal together. And here's where, let me just layer this once more. So what happens is, as time starts to pass, leaven or yeast or anything that kind of is a bit of a fermenting agent starts to become associated, figuratively speaking, with sin and with moral decay and with corruption in a person's heart. So that when we come to Matthew chapter 16, and Jesus turns to his disciples and says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, he's not saying that they make really bad bread, don't buy any from them. He's just saying, no, beware of people who look really good on the outside, but there's actually more sinful fermentation happening under the surface than we tend to notice. And so this whole festival becomes this really rich, symbolic way of talking not just about physically purifying our home, but of purifying our hearts and our lives so that we're ready to move quickly with God. If you have to wait for yeast to rise, you can't leave Egypt quickly. The point is we have to be ready to move with God quickly. What is holding us back from moving quickly with God? And this becomes a really rich way of talking about that. Let's maybe just move to wrap up here a little bit, and I'll just kind of get to the 10th plague itself here, jumping ahead to verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people. You and the Israelites go worship the Lord as you have requested." Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go and bless me. The 10th plague arrives. I find myself wondering what it must have been like to be sitting in one of the Hebrew households when the first cry echoed out somewhere in the night and in the street, to be picked up by another and another. And as this general sound of heart-rending sadness starts to be carried on the evening breeze, what that would have felt like to be sitting in a home and going, is this really happening? There's a solemnness to this story as Israel departs. There is no joy-filled, finger-pointing celebration any more than there appears to be on God's part. There is no rejoicing in the death of these persons. And Pharaoh has finally had enough. Just get out. In fact, this is the first time Pharaoh actually uses the word Israelite as a way of kind of tacitly acknowledging them as an independent people group. There are other places we could park in the verses that follow that would be interesting. Verse 38, if you're curious, implies it's a mixed group that leaves Egypt. I've always found that curious. We go, so was there a broader ethnically diverse slave population of which some of them left with the Israelites? Did some of the Egyptians convert, if you will, and say we've had enough of what we see in our country? We were looking for a new land and a new home as well. We're left to wonder. Verse 48 implies that the Passover is not an ethnically specific or exclusive meal. Foreigners were allowed to participate in this, but it was a believer's meal. To participate in this was a way of saying, this is the God that we follow, these are the people we identify with. And so to participate in this circumcision in the Old Testament becomes the public way of declaring, these are the people I want to identify with and the God I want to follow. And so it becomes kind of the necessary thing. And then, of course, there's the redeeming of the firstborn. We don't have time to talk about that. But it becomes a practice that is an ongoing reminder for Israel of whose they are, if you will, that they have been purchased as a people in order to serve God. This is a hard story for us to have to sit with, of judgment, of death, and of the cost of what it means or took to rescue this particular people so that they could serve God. I want to say this is also a powerful story because it becomes the framework through which you and I understand our story. The creation story is the lens through which we see and understand Exodus. What you and I discover as we get to our New Testament is that it is the Exodus story and Exodus language that helps us understand the Jesus event. And I've got references up there. I don't have time to kind of cite them. But this is our story of a sin debt demanding death that all of us owe. Of a death that is destined to come to all people equally. But we also read, this is in 1 Corinthians, of a Passover lamb. And not a literal lamb in this case, but of someone who will come and who will be a substitute for our sin. And so the New Testament uses language of Jesus' death and resurrection as being the last sacrifice through which he purchased a people for God who no longer are slaves. That's an Exodus word. We go, I'm not to sin. Everybody serves somebody. Purchased so that we can serve and worship our God. And 1 Peter 2 is a fabulous passage because Peter dips back into Exodus chapter 19. Israel's at Sinai. It's kind of the constitution of the Israelite people, if I can use that language. And we haven't gotten there yet, so spoiler alert. But he dips into the language that is very specific between God and Israel, and he takes it and he now applies it to anyone and everyone who wants to identify with and follow Jesus. Powerful picture of what it means to be freed to be the people of God in this world. And friends, no matter how hard this story is for you and for me to have to hear and to interact with, I want to suggest there is good news in this hard story. Because the judge who pronounces a heavy sentence also becomes the one who, after pronouncing sentence, climbs down off of his bench to take the place of the defendant. Judgment is God's strange and alien work. And the way our judge continues to handle that surprise us. But this is good news. Our weekly calendar has been reoriented to tell this story, if you think about it. An event of this significance, of the forming of a people, I want to say it's Corinthians, it talks about if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. New beginnings like this need to be marked in some way so that we are forever shaped and oriented in and around them. Why don't we worship on the Jewish Sabbath anymore? Because an event like Jesus' death and resurrection just needs to be a new way that we remember and orient our lives. Our gathering on a Sunday morning is a calendar way that we mark every week, whether we talk about it specifically or not. The fact we are here or tuning in with us on Sunday morning to worship is part of our story that we are continually invited to enter into and to live out of. And so next week we will participate in kind of our version of the Passover, if you will. And because our Jewish friends, if they were anticipating the Passover meal, would go through their house and purge it of leaven, I feel like that's the assignment I want to give you. And no, you don't have to actually put dry breadcrumbs around your house. Let me give you the following suggestion. Psalm chapter 139 says the following: "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Found myself wondering if you and I would root out sin in our lives with the kind of passionate resolve that our Jewish friends search their houses for leaven, whether we might find our lives less clogged up with things that prohibit us from hearing the voice of God, that minimize our desire to spend time with God, and that keep us from being quick to move with God when he nudges us. So my simple application for you this morning is, I want you to pray these verses every day this week. You put them somewhere where you'll see them, as your bathroom mirror, your bedstand, on the dashboard in your car, on your computer in your office, whatever feels appropriate. Pray these verses every day this week. And as you do, quiet your heart to listen to God's voice. Whether there are words of encouragement he wants to speak, whether there's words of wisdom and direction he wants to offer, or whether there are words of course correction that we need to hear and listen to. And may he give us the courage to be quick to respond to him and to throw out stuff that is hindering us from following him wholeheartedly with perhaps the same kind of passion that we would throw out moldy breadcrumbs from our house. It's my hope that we come back next week, perhaps with lighter consciences and joy-filled hearts, to celebrate the freedom that is ours, the story that we continue to be able to live into because of what Jesus has done on our behalf. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks this morning for your tremendous love for us. We are sobered and we are reminded that you are not just our close friend and our buddy. You are a holy God. And you care too much about your creation not to respond and engage with it. And sometimes that involves judgment. And that certainly implies something that is coming in some way, shape, or form to all of us. May we not wiggle out from under the weight of that reality. May that penetrate our hearts in those places where we are stubborn, where we are resistant, where we have a little bit more of Pharaoh in us than we wish we did, so that we will bow our knees to you. And whether that's those that maybe have never made a decision to follow you for the first time, or whether those of us who have made that decision but continue to follow you with less than wholehearted passion, may this be something that you continue in your grace to confront us with, that we would respond to you. Give us sensitivity and insight as we look into our hearts, as we open them up for you to peer into in the week ahead. May you give us a joy-filled wonder at what's holding us back so that we would just be quicker to release these things. That we might experience life as you have intended, good life and life to the full. So thank you for the privilege that is ours to call ourselves your people, to continue to walk alongside each other in what it means to follow you faithfully and fully. We give ourselves to you. In Jesus' name, amen.